Good evening, and welcome back. Tonight, we're going to travel somewhere very far away. Not in distance, but in time. We're going back thousands of years to a world without electric light, without modern medicine, without a single drugstore aisle stocked with neatly wrapped products. We're going back to a world where women, ordinary women, mothers and daughters and grandmothers, quietly manage something that every single human civilization has had to face in its own way. Something so common, so universal, that it touched the life of nearly every woman who ever lived. And yet, for a very long time, it was a subject wrapped in silence. Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Maybe you're already lying down. Maybe the lights are off or dimmed low, with just the soft glow of your screen keeping you company. That's perfect. Tonight, we're talking about menstruation in the ancient world. How did women handle their periods before pads, before tampons, before plumbing, before privacy as we know it today? It's a question that doesn't get much attention in most history books. The grand stories of kings and wars and empires tend to crowd it out. But if you think about it for a moment, this is one of the most quietly important threads running through all of human history. Every civilization had to solve this problem, in its own way, using whatever materials were available, shaped by whatever beliefs they held about the body, about blood, about womanhood itself. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, we're going to walk gently through that history. We'll start in the dusty river valleys of ancient Egypt, where women used soft papyrus and linen, and where doctors wrote some of the very first medical texts about the female body. We'll wander into the shadowed temples and busy marketplaces of ancient Greece, where philosophers and physicians had surprisingly different opinions about what menstrual blood actually meant. We'll cross into the vast and structured world of ancient Rome, where wool and linen rags were washed and reused, and where superstition mixed strangely with practical daily life. We'll travel further still into ancient China, where herbal medicine shaped how women understood their own cycles. Into India, where ancient texts describe both reverence and restriction surrounding menstruating women. Into the cold forests of northern Europe, where Viking women fashioned what they had on hand into something workable. We'll visit the indigenous peoples of the Americas, who had their own deep traditions, often centered around moon lodges and rest. We'll look at medieval Europe, where the church's views on the body shaped how women were treated. And we'll end somewhere closer to our own time, at the slow, gradual invention of the modern products you might be using right now without a second thought. Imagine, for a moment, being a woman in one of these ancient worlds. Imagine waking before sunrise, already aware that today is different from yesterday. There is no convenient drawer to open. There is no aisle to visit. There is only what your mother taught you, what the women around you have always done, and whatever your hands can fashion from cloth, plant fiber, or wool. Imagine the quiet resourcefulness that must have lived inside nearly every woman across every culture and every century, simply because life required it. This is not a story of suffering, though there was certainly hardship in it. It is, more than anything, a story of quiet adaptation, of women figuring things out, generation after generation, century after century, long before anyone wrote it down in history books. It's a story that has mostly gone untold, simply because for so long, this was not something people spoke about openly. So settle in. Let your eyes grow heavy if they want to. There's no need to remember every detail tonight. Just let the history wash over you gently, like a slow river moving past ancient riverbanks, carrying stories that have waited a very long time to be told softly, calmly, at exactly the kind of hour when stories like this deserve to be heard. Let's begin in ancient Egypt, along the banks of the Nile. Imagine the soft warmth of an Egyptian evening, somewhere along the banks of the Nile, perhaps 4,000 years ago. The sun has lowered itself behind the western hills, the hills where the Egyptians believed the dead traveled into the afterlife, and the sky has turned the particular shade of orange and rose that seems to belong only to desert evenings. The river moves slowly, the way it always has, carrying silt and life to the fields on either side. Somewhere nearby, a woman finishes her work for the day. She has been weaving or grinding grain or tending to a small herd of goats. Her hands are tired in the comfortable way that comes from honest work, not exhaustion. She is also, on this particular evening, in the middle of her monthly cycle. And like every woman before her in this ancient civilization, she has her own quiet way of managing it. Ancient Egypt holds something remarkable in the history we're exploring tonight. It gives us some of the very first written records anywhere in the world that discuss women's bodies in detail. The Egyptians were remarkably advanced for their time when it came to medicine. They kept detailed records, written on papyrus, a paper-like material made from the papyrus plant that grew abundantly along the riverbanks. These records, called medical papyri, survive even now, thousands of years later, preserved by the dry desert air that Egypt is so famous for. One of the most well-known of these documents is called the Kahin Gynecological Papyrus, named after the place where it was discovered. It dates back to around 1800 BCE, making it one of the oldest medical texts in the world. Within its faded lines, ancient Egyptian physicians wrote about women's health, fertility, pregnancy, and yes, menstruation. They believed the womb was connected to other organs throughout the body, and that irregularities in the menstrual cycle could affect a woman's overall health. It was an early, imperfect, but genuinely thoughtful attempt to understand something that had puzzled healers across every culture. So how did Egyptian women actually manage their periods, physically, day to day? Historians believe they likely used soft, rolled papyrus, the same plant material used to make their writing paper, as an early absorbent material. Papyrus, when softened and prepared correctly, could be surprisingly gentle and absorbent, not unlike the soft pulp materials used in some products today. Some historians also believe linen, a fabric the Egyptians were famous for producing in fine, lightweight versions, was used as well, likely folded into a soft cloth and tucked closely against the body, then washed and reused. Picture this for a moment. A woman rinsing a strip of linen in the cool water of the Nile at dawn, the river mist still hanging low over the water, birds calling somewhere in the reeds. She wrings it out gently, lays in the sun to dry on a warm stone, and goes about the rest of her day. There was no shame whispered in her ear by society in quite the way we might imagine, though Egyptian beliefs around menstruation were complex. Interestingly, the ancient Egyptians did not seem to view menstruation with the same fear or impurity that some later cultures developed. Egyptian society had a relatively practical view of the body. Women worked, owned property, ran businesses, and held religious positions even during their menstrual cycle. There is far less evidence in Egyptian writing of women being isolated or restricted during their periods compared to what we will see in other ancient cultures later tonight. Egyptian women may have also used a kind of early tampon, softened and rolled papyrus designed to be inserted, based on some interpretations of ancient texts, though this remains debated among historians, since the surviving documents are incomplete and sometimes difficult to translate with certainty. What is clear is that Egyptian women were resourceful. They lived in a society with abundant natural materials, the papyrus plant growing thick along the riverbanks, fine linen produced in workshops throughout the kingdom, and they used what their environment gave them. There's something quietly beautiful about imagining this. A civilization so advanced that it built pyramids reaching toward the sky, that mapped the stars, that developed early forms of surgery, also developed simple, practical solutions for one of the most universal experiences a woman could have. The grandeur of ancient Egypt, the gold, the temples, the pharaohs, existed alongside this small, quiet, human detail. A woman by the river, managing her body with the same calm competence she brought to everything else in her day. As the stars begin to appear over the Nile, and as that Egyptian woman settles down for the night in her home of mud brick and palm wood, her evening is not so different from the evening you might be having right now. Tired from the day, comfortable in familiar routines, ready for rest. Let's drift now toward another ancient world, one filled with marble columns and philosophers debating in open courtyards, where opinions on menstruation took a rather different shape. Ancient Greece and the wandering womb. Imagine yourself now in ancient Greece, perhaps in Athens, several centuries after the time of that Egyptian woman by the Nile. The air here smells different, drier, carrying the scent of olive groves and salt from the nearby sea. Cicadas hum steadily in the warm afternoon, a sound so constant it almost becomes silence itself. Somewhere in the city, men gather in the agora, the open marketplace, discussing philosophy, politics, and the nature of the universe. Women, meanwhile, manage households, raise children, and quietly continue lives that history rarely bothered to record in detail. Ancient Greek medicine held some surprisingly strange beliefs about the female body, beliefs that would shape Western thinking about menstruation for centuries to come. The most influential of these came from a concept called the wandering womb. Greek physicians, including the famous Hippocrates, believed that the womb was not fixed in place inside a woman's body. Instead, they believed it could move, wandering through the body if it became too dry or too empty, sometimes pressing against other organs and causing illness. This belief sounds almost dreamlike to modern ears, but to the ancient Greeks, it was a serious medical theory. They believed that regular menstruation kept the womb properly nourished and in place. If a woman's periods became irregular or stopped altogether, physicians worried the womb might begin to wander, causing all sorts of unrelated symptoms throughout the body: fainting, anxiety, even what we might now call hysteria, a word that actually comes from the Greek word for womb, hysteria. Despite these unusual beliefs about the cause of menstruation, ancient Greek women still needed practical solutions for managing their monthly cycles. Historical evidence suggests Greek women used soft cloth, likely made from linen or wool, wrapped and tucked similarly to how Egyptian women used their materials. Wool was abundant in Greece, sheep grazing on the rocky hillsides that covered much of the countryside, and wool naturally holds a certain amount of moisture, making a practical, if imperfect, choice. There's an interesting historical mention from ancient Greek sources describing a woman named Hypatia, who lived later in antiquity, in Alexandria, a city that blended Greek and Egyptian cultures. While Hypatia herself lived centuries after the height of classical Greece, the stories about her reflect something important. One famous, though debated tale describes her throwing a menstrual cloth toward a man who was pursuing her romantically, supposedly to demonstrate that she was simply a woman, made of the same biological reality as anyone else, not some idealized, untouchable figure. Whether this story is entirely historically accurate or partly legend, it tells us something meaningful. Even educated, respected women in the ancient world experienced menstruation as a normal, unremarkable part of life, something practical rather than purely shameful. Greek attitudes toward menstruation were complicated, sitting somewhere between practical acceptance and superstition. Some ancient Greek writings suggest menstruating women were thought to have certain powers or dangers, depending on perspective. Pliny the Elder, although Roman rather than Greek, recorded later Greek-influenced beliefs claiming that a menstruating woman's touch could dull a sword's edge, sour wine, or wilt crops. These beliefs likely stemmed from a mixture of genuine misunderstanding about biology and deeper cultural anxieties about the power of fertility and blood. At the same time, Greek medical writers took menstruation seriously as a health indicator. Physicians like Hippocrates and later Galen wrote extensively about menstrual health, believing that regular cycles were essential to a woman's overall well-being. Treatments for irregular periods included herbal remedies, dietary changes, and in some cases, what we would now recognize as early gynecological care, even if filtered through theories about wandering organs and bodily humors that we now understand differently. Picture a Greek woman finishing her household duties as the sun begins to set behind the Acropolis, its marble columns catching the last golden light of the day. She moves through her home, perhaps preparing simple bread and olives for the evening meal, her mind occupied with the same ordinary concerns women have carried across every century: family, work, small daily worries. Her period today is simply part of her week, managed quietly with cloth and wool, without grand discussion, without modern convenience, but also without the level of shame that later centuries would sometimes attach to it. As the cicadas continue their endless hum and the sky deepens into evening blue, let's travel onward toward the structured, practical world of ancient Rome, where Roman engineering met everyday human need in fascinating ways. Rome, wool, and the practical empire. Now imagine the busy streets of ancient Rome. Centuries later, the air filled with the noise of cart wheels on stone roads, distant shouting from a nearby market, the smell of bread baking somewhere close. Rome was an empire built on practicality, on engineering, on solving problems efficiently across a vast and diverse territory. This same practical spirit extended, in its own quiet way, to how Roman women managed their monthly cycles. Roman women, much like their Greek predecessors, primarily used wool and linen cloth as absorbent material during menstruation. Rome was famous throughout the ancient world for its textile production. Vast quantities of wool processed from sheep, raised across Italy, Gaul, and Spain, woven into everything from togas to simple undergarments. This abundance of wool meant Roman women had reasonably good access to soft, somewhat absorbent material, even if it required regular washing and reuse. Historical sources suggest some Roman women also used softened papyrus, inherited indirectly through trade and cultural exchange with Egypt, which became a Roman province after the famous defeat of Cleopatra. Egypt's resources, including papyrus, flowed into Roman markets, meaning some wealthier Roman women may have had access to the same materials Egyptian women had used centuries earlier. Roman attitudes toward menstruation were shaped heavily by the writings of Pliny the Elder, a Roman scholar who compiled an enormous encyclopedia of natural knowledge in the 1st century. Unfortunately for the reputation of menstruating women everywhere, Pliny recorded some remarkably exaggerated and superstitious claims. He wrote that menstrual blood could turn wine sour, cause crops to wither, dull the blade of a knife, kill bees, and even drive dogs mad if they tasted it. He claimed a menstruating woman walking through a field could cause considerable agricultural damage, simply through her presence. It's worth pausing here for a gentle moment of perspective. Pliny's writings, however influential, do not necessarily reflect how ordinary Roman women experience their own lives day to day. Educated elite writers often recorded sensational beliefs that may not have matched the practical, unremarkable way most women actually lived. A woman tending her household, raising children, managing daily chores, likely experienced her period as simply another part of her month, requiring practical solutions rather than constant anxious superstition. Roman medical knowledge, drawing heavily from earlier Greek theories, continued to believe menstruation was tied to overall bodily health. Physicians like Soranus of Ephesus, who practiced gynecology in Rome during the 2nd century, wrote detailed medical texts about women's reproductive health, including guidance on diet, exercise, and care during menstruation. Soranus actually held more progressive views than many of his contemporaries, advising that moderate activity and a balanced diet were beneficial during a woman's cycle, rather than enforce complete rest. A notably practical and surprisingly modern-sounding piece of advice. Roman bathhouses, those famous communal spaces filled with steam, warm water, and quiet conversation, also played a role in how Roman women managed personal hygiene generally, including during menstruation. Regular bathing was deeply embedded in Roman culture, and while specific historical detail about menstrual hygiene practices within bathhouses remains limited, it's reasonable to imagine that access to warm water and private bathing spaces provided some degree of comfort and cleanliness that women in less developed infrastructure might not have had. Picture, for a moment, a Roman woman returning home through quiet evening streets after visiting the public baths, her hair still slightly damp, wrapped in a simple woolen cloak against the cooling evening air. She has washed and changed her cloth for the night, a quiet, practical routine repeated identically by countless other women throughout the vast empire, from Britain in the cold north to Egypt in the warm south, all part of the same sprawling Roman world, all managing the same universal experience in their own local way. As oil lamps begin flickering to life in windows throughout the city, casting warm orange light onto narrow cobblestone streets, let's continue our gentle journey eastward, toward ancient China, where herbal medicine and balance shaped an entirely different philosophy of womanhood. Drift now toward ancient China, somewhere during the era of the Han Dynasty, more than 2,000 years ago. Imagine soft mist settling over terraced rice fields at dusk, the gentle sound of a nearby stream, the distant call of birds returning to roost in bamboo groves. This is a civilization deeply rooted in philosophy, in balance, in the idea that the human body reflects larger natural rhythms, much like the changing seasons or the flow of rivers. Traditional Chinese medicine, which began developing many of its core principles during this era, held a particular reverence for menstrual health. Unlike some Western traditions that viewed menstrual blood with suspicion or fear, ancient Chinese medical philosophy generally viewed menstruation as an important sign of a woman's internal balance, connected closely to concepts of qi, the vital energy believed to flow through the body, and blood, seen as deeply connected to both physical and emotional well-being. Ancient Chinese women used soft cloth, often made from cotton once it became more widely cultivated, or earlier hemp fiber, which had been used in China for textile production for thousands of years, even before cotton became common. These cloths were washed carefully and reused, much like in other ancient cultures we've already visited tonight. Hygiene was taken seriously, influenced by Chinese medical philosophy that connected cleanliness directly to maintaining healthy internal balance. One of the most fascinating aspects of ancient Chinese approaches to menstruation involves extensive herbal medicine. Traditional Chinese medicine developed detailed theories about how diet and herbal remedies could help regulate menstrual cycles, ease discomfort, and maintain what practitioners called balance between yin and yang energies within the body. Herbs like donkey, sometimes called female ginseng even today, were used to support menstrual health, a practice with roots stretching back thousands of years and still used in traditional medicine in parts of the world today. Chinese women were also encouraged, according to traditional medical texts, to pay close attention to warmth during menstruation. Cold was believed to disrupt the natural flow of blood and energy within the body, so warm foods, warm baths when possible, and avoiding cold exposure during one's period were common practices rooted deeply in traditional medical philosophy. This belief, interestingly, persists in some forms even today in parts of East Asia, where warm drinks and avoiding cold foods during menstruation remain a commonly followed tradition passed down through generations. There's a gentle, almost poetic quality to how ancient Chinese philosophy approached this aspect of womanhood. Rather than viewing menstruation purely as something messy or burdensome to manage, ancient Chinese medical thought often framed it as a visible, monthly reflection of a woman's deeper internal harmony, something to be cared for gently, nurtured through warmth, proper diet, and herbal support, rather than something to be hidden away in shame. That said, ancient Chinese society, like nearly every ancient culture we'll explore tonight, was not without its own restrictions and taboos. Some traditional beliefs held that menstruating women should avoid certain religious or ceremonial activities, reflecting broader East Asian and indeed worldwide patterns of associating menstrual blood with spiritual impurity in specific ritual contexts, even while medical philosophy elsewhere treated the same blood as a sign of healthy balance. Human beliefs, it seems, have rarely been entirely consistent on this topic, holding two seemingly contradictory ideas at once: reverence in one context, restriction in another. Imagine a young woman in ancient China finishing her evening tasks, perhaps preparing warm ginger tea, as the mist outside thickens around her family's modest home near the rice terraces. She moves with practiced ease, the same quiet competence women across every ancient civilization brought to this universal monthly task. Her hands sure and familiar with the soft cloth she has prepared, warmed slightly by the fire before use, following gentle guidance about warmth passed down from her mother, and her mother's mother before that, stretching back through countless generations she will never fully know, yet remains quietly connected to. As the mist deepens in a full evening darkness over the rice terraces, and as lanterns begin glowing softly in nearby village windows, let's continue our journey now toward the Indian subcontinent, where ancient texts reveal a complicated blend of deep reverence and strict social restriction. Ancient India, sacred texts, and complicated traditions. Imagine now the warm evening air of the ancient Indian subcontinent, perhaps somewhere along the banks of a wide, slow-moving river, the kind that has nourished civilizations here for thousands of years. The scent of jasmine drifts gently on the breeze, mixed with the earthy smell of recently watered soil. Temple bells ring somewhere in the distance, soft and rhythmic, marking the quiet transition from day into evening. Ancient Indian civilization developed one of the most complex, layered relationships with menstruation found anywhere in the ancient world, a relationship that mixed deep spiritual reverence with significant social restriction, sometimes within the very same religious traditions. Hindu mythology actually contains a striking story connecting menstruation directly to the divine. According to certain traditional beliefs, particularly associated with the powerful goddess temple of Kamakhya in the northeastern region of Assam, the goddess herself is believed to menstruate annually, an event still celebrated today through the Ambubachi Mela festival, where the temple is symbolically closed for several days, representing the goddess's menstrual period, before reopening with celebration and renewed reverence. This tradition reflects an ancient and surprisingly progressive idea that menstruation, far from being purely shameful, is connected to powerful, even sacred, feminine creative energy, mirroring the fertility of the earth itself. And yet, alongside this reverence, ancient Indian society also developed significant practical restrictions around menstruating women, particularly within certain religious and social contexts. Many ancient texts describe practices where menstruating women were temporarily excluded from cooking, from religious ceremonies, and sometimes from general household activities, required instead to rest separately for a period of days. While this could certainly reflect restrictive social attitudes toward women's bodies, some historians also suggest a more practical undertone existed within these traditions, offering women an enforced period of rest from heavy daily labor during physically demanding menstrual days, in societies where women otherwise worked continuously from sunrise to sunset. In terms of practical, physical management of menstruation itself, ancient Indian women, much like women across the ancient world, primarily used soft cotton cloth, washed and reused carefully. India has an extremely long history of cotton cultivation and weaving, stretching back thousands of years, with archaeological evidence of cotton textile production found at sites belonging to the ancient Indus Valley Civilization, one of the oldest urban civilizations in human history, predating even some of the developments we've discussed tonight in Egypt and Mesopotamia. Ancient Ayurvedic medicine, a traditional Indian medical system still practiced today, developed detailed theories about menstrual health remarkably similar in spirit to Chinese medical philosophy, emphasizing balance, proper diet, and gentle care during menstruation. Ayurvedic texts recommended specific foods believed to support healthy menstrual flow, advised rest during particularly heavy or painful days, and developed herbal remedies using plants like turmeric, ginger, and sesame, believed to ease discomfort and support the body's natural rhythms. There's a particularly beautiful concept found within some traditional Indian approaches to menstruation, the idea of treating it as a time of quiet retreat rather than purely restriction. In certain interpretations, the enforced rest associated with menstruation wasn't necessarily meant as punishment or shame, but rather as a brief, sanctioned pause, a few days where a woman's typically endless responsibilities to family and household were temporarily set aside, allowing her body genuine rest in a world that otherwise offered women very few official breaks from constant labor. Of course, as with every culture we've explored tonight, the lived reality likely varied enormously depending on region, social class, family beliefs, and individual circumstances. Some women may have experienced these traditions as genuinely restful and even spiritually meaningful, while others may have experienced the same restrictions as isolating or unfairly limiting, depending entirely on the specific community and household they belong to. Imagine a young woman somewhere along that ancient riverbank, perhaps stepping away from her usual daily tasks for a few quiet days, settling into a separate, calm corner of her family's home, soft cotton cloth carefully prepared, a small clay cup of warm spiced milk beside her, infused with turmeric and a touch of honey, prepared by her mother to ease the natural discomfort of her cycle. Outside, temple bells continue their soft, rhythmic ringing, marking time the way they have for centuries, as the warm evening settles gently over the ancient riverbank. As those temple bells fade softly into the deepening night, let's travel now toward colder lands, toward the windswept fjords and dense forests of ancient northern Europe, where Viking women faced a considerably harsher climate, yet found their own practical solutions all the same. The Viking North and practical resilience. Imagine now traveling far to the north, toward the cold, dramatic landscapes of ancient Scandinavia, somewhere around the 8th or 9th century. Picture steep fjords carved by ancient glaciers, dark pine forests stretching endlessly toward distant snow-capped mountains, and the chill air carrying the scent of wood smoke from a nearby longhouse. This is the world of the Vikings, a culture often remembered for seafaring exploration and fierce warriors, but equally filled with ordinary daily life, farming, weaving, cooking, and yes, the same universal monthly experience women everywhere have managed throughout history. Viking women, much like women across nearly every ancient culture we've explored tonight, used what their environment provided. Wool was abundant throughout Scandinavia, sheep well suited to the cold climate, providing thick, warm fleece used for nearly every textile need within Viking society, clothing, blankets, sailcloth for their famous longships, and quite likely, menstrual cloth as well. Wool's natural properties, including a degree of water resistance combined with absorbency once processed correctly, made it a reasonably practical choice given available resources. Linen, made from flax, a plant cultivated throughout northern Europe since ancient times, also played an important role in Viking textile production, and likely supplemented wool as material for menstrual cloths, particularly among women with access to finer woven fabrics through trade or social status. Viking society held a complicated, sometimes contradictory relationship with menstrual blood and women's bodies generally. Norse mythology and folklore contain references to seed, a form of magic closely associated with women, sometimes intertwined culturally with ideas about female bodily fluids holding particular power, whether protective, dangerous, or simply mysterious, depending on the specific story or regional belief. Unlike the heavily documented medical traditions we explored in Egypt, Greece, China, and India, written records from Viking society remain comparatively sparse regarding specific practical details of menstrual management. Since much of Norse culture relied on oral tradition rather than extensive written medical texts, with literacy concentrated mainly around runic inscriptions rather than detailed medical documentation. However, archaeological evidence and later historical accounts suggest Viking women, much like their counterparts across the rest of the ancient world, simply managed menstruation through practical, resourceful means, using readily available cloth, washed regularly in cold fjord streams or heated water within their longhouses, dried by smoky hearth fires that burned constantly throughout long Scandinavian winters. Picture a Viking woman finishing her evening chores within a warm, smoky longhouse, the rhythmic crackle of the hearth fire providing both light and welcome warmth against the bitter cold outside. She moves efficiently between tasks, tending a simmering pot of stew, checking on children already settled on a fur-covered sleeping benches built into the longhouse walls. Her menstrual cloth, made from softened wool, dries quietly near the fire, prepared for tomorrow's use. A small, practical detail tucked quietly within an otherwise demanding daily routine that required near-constant resourcefulness simply to survive the harsh Scandinavian climate. Viking society, much like ancient Rome, valued practicality highly, women holding significant responsibility within Norse households, managing farms, finances, and family affairs, particularly during the long months when men traveled abroad on trading voyages or raiding expeditions. This practical, capable approach to daily life likely extended naturally to how Viking women approach menstruation as well, simply another task requiring competent, quiet management rather than extensive discussion or elaborate ritual. There's something quietly admirable about imagining these resilient women, managing not only their monthly cycles, but entire households and farms, within one of history's harshest climates, using little more than wool, fire, and generations of practical knowledge passed down through careful oral tradition from mother to daughter, surviving and indeed thriving within a demanding northern world that offered little patience for anything but practical solutions. As the fjord winds howl softly outside the longhouse walls, and as the hearth fire continues its steady crackling warmth, let's travel now across a vast ocean, toward the indigenous peoples of North America, where moontime traditions offered an entirely different, deeply spiritual approach to this same universal experience. Indigenous traditions and the sacred moontime. Imagine now crossing a vast ocean, arriving somewhere within the rich, diverse landscapes of indigenous North America, long before European contact reshaped the continent's history. Picture a quiet forest clearing somewhere within what is now the northeastern woodlands, perhaps among Haudenosaunee, also known as Iroquois communities. Autumn leaves drifting slowly through cool evening air, wood smoke curling gently from a nearby longhouse, the distant call of an owl somewhere deep within the surrounding forest. Many indigenous cultures across North America developed deeply spiritual, often reverent traditions surrounding menstruation, frequently referred to as moontime, reflecting the natural connection observed between a woman's monthly cycle and the lunar cycle moving steadily across the night sky above. Rather than viewing menstruation purely as something requiring hidden management or shame, many indigenous traditions instead framed moontime as a sacred period of power, rest, and spiritual connection. Among various Native American nations, including certain Lakota, Ojibwe, and Cherokee traditions, women during their moon time were sometimes secluded within special structures often called moon lodges, small, dedicated spaces separate from daily communal life, where women could rest fully from regular responsibilities for the duration of their cycle. This seclusion, much like certain traditions we explored earlier in ancient India, carried complex layered meaning, partly rooted in spiritual beliefs about feminine power being particularly heightened during menstruation, requiring careful spiritual management, and partly offering genuine practical rest within societies where women otherwise carried significant daily labor responsibilities, farming, food preparation, childcare, and craft production. In terms of practical physical management, indigenous women across various North American nations used materials readily available within their local environment: soft-tanned animal hide, particularly buckskin, prepared and softened through careful traditional tanning methods passed down through generations, along with soft plant fibers, mosses, and in certain regions, specially prepared cattail fluff, a soft, absorbent material gathered from cattail plants common throughout wetland areas. Across much of North America, sphagnum moss, in particular, deserves special mention here, since various indigenous communities, along with several other ancient cultures around the world we haven't yet discussed tonight, including certain communities in Scotland and parts of Northern Europe, discovered this remarkable natural material held genuinely impressive absorbent properties, alongside natural antibacterial qualities, making it a surprisingly effective, gentle, and widely available choice for menstrual care, freely growing throughout damp forest and wetland environments across much of the Northern Hemisphere. The spiritual dimension surrounding moontime within many indigenous traditions often emphasize connection rather than isolation in the way we might initially imagine isolation. While women rested separately during this time, moon lodges frequently became spaces of quiet community among women themselves, mothers, sisters, and grandmothers often gathering together during their respective cycles, sharing quiet conversation, traditional stories, and practical wisdom passed down through generations, creating a sense of shared sisterhood around an experience common to every woman within the community. Imagine a young woman entering a moon lodge for perhaps the first time, guided gently by an older female relative, perhaps her grandmother, who settles beside her near a small, carefully tended fire, beginning the quiet process of teaching practical knowledge, how to prepare soft moss or hide for comfortable use, alongside spiritual teachings about honoring this natural rhythm rather than fearing or hiding from it. Teachings passed down unchanged through countless generations stretching back, long before written history began documenting this particular corner of the world. There's a profound gentleness within many of these indigenous traditions, framing menstruation not as something burdensome requiring quiet shame, but rather as a natural, even sacred rhythm connecting women directly to the moon, to the Earth's natural cycles, and to generations of women before them who experienced this exact same monthly process, managed using gifts gathered directly from the surrounding natural world, moss, hide, and plant fiber, transformed through careful traditional knowledge into practical, respectful solutions. As that autumn forest settles into deeper evening darkness, the owl's distant call fading slowly into silence, let's travel once more, this time toward medieval Europe, where attitudes shifted considerably, shaped heavily by religious doctrine and shifting social structures throughout the centuries following the fall of Rome. Medieval Europe and the weight of religious belief. Imagine now arriving within medieval Europe, perhaps somewhere around the 12th or 13th century, within a modest stone village nestled among rolling green hills somewhere in what is now France or England. Picture narrow dirt paths winding between simple thatched roof cottages, the distant sound of church bells marking the hours, smoke curling steadily from cottage chimneys against a gray, overcast sky typical of northern European weather. Medieval European society developed a considerably more restrictive, often anxious relationship with menstruation compared to several of the traditions we've explored so far tonight, heavily influenced by religious doctrine that increasingly framed the female body, and particularly menstrual blood, through a lens of impurity and moral caution. The Catholic Church, the dominant religious and social authority throughout most of medieval Europe, drew heavily upon certain interpretations of biblical texts, particularly passages from the Old Testament's book of Leviticus, which described menstruating women as ritually unclean for a period of days. While Jewish religious tradition had developed nuanced, detailed practices around these concepts for centuries, including specific purification rituals known as mikvah, medieval Christian European interpretation often simplified these ideas into a generally negative, anxious view toward menstruation, framing it primarily through associations with sin, impurity, and the biblical story of Eve. This religious framing had genuine practical consequences for medieval women. Some medieval religious texts advised women to avoid receiving communion during their menstrual period, considering it spiritually inappropriate. Certain medical texts of the era, heavily influenced by ancient Greek humoral theory we discussed earlier, combined with religious anxiety, sometimes described menstrual blood using genuinely unfortunate language, associating it with toxicity or corruption within the body, requiring regular release, rather than understanding it as the healthy biological process we now know it to be. Despite this challenging social and religious backdrop, medieval women still needed practical solutions for managing their monthly cycles, and they found them using the same resourceful, quiet competence women have demonstrated throughout every era we've explored tonight. Linen remained the primary material used throughout medieval Europe, readily available through widespread flax cultivation and weaving traditions stretching back centuries. Women folded and tucked linen cloth, washing and reusing it carefully, drying it discreetly, often near household fires during colder months, continuing essentially the same practical approach used by ancient Egyptian, Greek, and Roman women centuries earlier. Medieval medical texts, despite their sometimes troubling theoretical framing, did offer some genuinely practical herbal guidance for managing menstrual discomfort. Herbs like chamomile, mugwort, and various other plants believed to ease cramping and discomfort appear repeatedly throughout surviving medieval medical manuscripts, suggesting that despite official religious anxiety surrounding menstruation, practical care and genuine concern for women's comfort continued quietly within everyday medieval households, passed down through generations of women sharing herbal knowledge regardless of official church teaching. It's worth pausing here for a gentle moment of reflection. The medieval period we're discussing tonight represents perhaps one of the more challenging chapters in this broader history, where official religious and medical doctrine often framed something entirely natural through a lens of anxiety and moral caution. And yet, even within this challenging social context, ordinary medieval women continued managing their bodies with the same quiet resourcefulness women have shown throughout every culture and century we've explored tonight, finding practical comfort and care for one another, regardless of what official texts or church doctrine claimed. Picture a medieval woman finishing her evening tasks within a small stone cottage, the fire burning low, casting warm flickering light across simple wooden furniture and a stone hearth. She has quietly washed and dried her linen cloth near the fire's gentle warmth, perhaps sipping a small cup of warm chamomile tea prepared by an older female relative who taught her, just as her own mother once taught her, the practical herbal remedies that ease the natural discomfort of her monthly cycle. Knowledge passed quietly between women, regardless of what official religious texts of the era claimed about impurity or shame. As that medieval fire continues its gentle, steady glow against the cool evening air outside, And as church bells somewhere in the distance mark the final hour before sleep, let's travel forward now, gently approaching more recent centuries, toward the slow, gradual transition from ancient practical methods toward the modern products many of us use today without much thought. The slow road toward modern solutions. Imagine now traveling forward through several more centuries, watching gently as history slowly unfolds toward more familiar territory. Picture the gradual transition from medieval stone cottages toward bustling towns and cities, candlelight giving way slowly to gas lamps, and eventually, electric light beginning to illuminate evening streets in ways our earlier ancient travelers could never have imagined. Throughout the centuries following medieval Europe, well into the 1700s and 1800s, the fundamental practical approach to menstrual management actually changed remarkably little compared to the dramatic technological and social transformations occurring throughout the rest of society. Women throughout most of Europe and colonial America continued primarily using washable cloth, typically linen or cotton, folded carefully and secured using simple ties or pins, a method essentially unchanged in its basic principle from ancient Egyptian, Greek, and Roman practices we explored earlier tonight. It wasn't until the late 1800s, and particularly the early 1900s, that significant, deliberate innovation toward modern menstrual products truly began. Interestingly, one of the earliest commercial developments emerged somewhat by accident, connected to advances made during the First World War. French nurses working in field hospitals noticed that cotton, a highly absorbent material originally developed by Kimberly-Clark for use as surgical bandages due to its impressive absorbency, worked remarkably well when repurposed for personal menstrual use. After the war concluded, Kimberly-Clark recognized this practical discovery and began marketing the material commercially under the brand name Kotex. Introduced in 1920, generally considered among the first widely available disposable sanitary pads. This represented a genuinely significant shift after literally thousands of years of washable cloth being the dominant practical solution across nearly every culture we've explored tonight. For the first time in recorded history, disposable, commercially manufactured products began entering ordinary households, gradually transforming how millions of women approached menstrual management. Around this same general period, the tampon also began its modern commercial development. Although various ancient cultures, as we discussed earlier regarding ancient Egypt, may have experimented with early internal absorbent materials using softened papyrus, the modern tampon, as commonly recognized today, was patented in 1931 by Dr. Earl Haas, an American physician. His design, featuring a compressed cotton applicator, eventually became commercially available under the now widely recognized Tampax brand beginning in 1933. These early 20th century innovations did not transform society's attitudes overnight. Significant social stigma and discomfort surrounding open discussion of menstruation persisted for decades, even as products became more widely available commercially. Advertising from this era often relied heavily on vague, indirect language, euphemisms, and reassuring imagery emphasizing discretion and secrecy rather than direct, open discussion, reflecting broader societal discomfort that, in many ways, echoed centuries of inherited silence stretching back through medieval religious anxiety, all the way to ancient superstition we explored earlier regarding figures like Pliny the Elder. Gradually, throughout the mid to late 20th century, products continued evolving, adhesive strips eventually replacing earlier belt and pin systems for securing pads, materials becoming increasingly refined and comfortable, and eventually, by the latter decades of the 20th century, alongside slowly shifting social attitudes, advertising and public conversation began gradually becoming more direct and open. Though full destigmatization remains, even today, an ongoing process within many societies worldwide. It's worth pausing here for a moment of gentle reflection on just how recent these modern conveniences actually are, when measured against the vast scope of human history we've traveled through together tonight. For literally thousands of years, stretching from ancient Egypt through Greece, Rome, China, India, Viking Scandinavia, indigenous North America, and medieval Europe, women managed this universal monthly experience using cloth, wool, linen, moss, hide, and plant fiber, carefully washed, dried, and reused generation after generation, century after century. The disposable products many of us use today, without a second thought, represent merely the final few minutes, historically speaking, within an otherwise vast, multi-thousand-year continuous thread of quiet feminine resourcefulness. As streetlights flicker on across an early 20th century city street, gas lamps slowly giving way to electric light, and as conversations about women's health begin, very gradually, opening up within public discourse for perhaps the first time in recorded history, let's settle now into our final chapter tonight, gently reflecting on this entire journey we've traveled together across so many centuries and civilizations. Threads that connect us all. Imagine, finally, stepping back from all the individual details we've explored tonight, the papyrus and linen along the Nile, the wandering womb theories whispered through Greek philosophy, the practical wool solutions throughout the Roman Empire, the warm herbal balance valued throughout ancient China, the complicated blend of sacred reverence and social restriction across ancient India, the quiet resilience of Viking women managing harsh northern winters, the spiritual moontime traditions, honored among indigenous North American communities, the religious anxiety that shaped medieval European attitudes, and finally, the gradual, surprisingly recent development of the modern products many of us reach for today without much conscious thought. What becomes clear when we step back and consider this entire sweeping journey together is just how universal, and yet how diverse, humanity's relationship with menstruation has always been. Every single civilization we visited tonight, regardless of geography, religion, technology, or social structure, faced this exact same biological reality. And every single one developed its own thoughtful, resourceful, deeply human response, shaped by whatever materials, beliefs, and social structures happen to surround it. There's something quietly profound about recognizing this thread connecting women across literally thousands of years and countless different cultures. An ancient Egyptian woman rinsing soft linen along the banks of the Nile. A Greek woman managing her household beneath the marble columns of Athens. A Roman woman returning from the public baths through quiet evening streets. A Chinese woman preparing warm herbal tea beside misty rice terraces. An Indian woman resting quietly during her sacred moon days near a slow-moving river. A Viking woman tending her hearth fire against the bitter cold of a Scandinavian winter. An indigenous woman gathered together with female relatives within the quiet warmth of a moon lodge. A medieval woman quietly sipping chamomile tea beside a humble stone cottage fire. Each of them, across centuries and continents, managing the exact same universal experience, using whatever wisdom, materials, and quiet resourcefulness their particular world provided. None of these women likely thought of themselves as part of some grand historical narrative. They were simply living their lives, managing ordinary days, tending families, completing daily work, finding practical solutions to a universal challenge using whatever their environment and cultural knowledge provided. And yet, viewed together, across this vast historical tapestry we've traveled through tonight, their countless small, quiet acts of resourcefulness form something genuinely remarkable, an unbroken thread of feminine adaptation and quiet strength stretching across the entire history of human civilization. When we compare this vast historical journey to our own modern world, filled with disposable products, comfortable plumbing, private bathrooms, and increasingly open public conversation about women's health, it becomes easier to appreciate just how recent, and indeed how fortunate, many of our current conveniences truly are. For thousands of years, women managed this experience using nothing more than cloth, careful washing, herbal remedies, and quiet wisdom passed gently from mother to daughter, across countless generations whose names we will never know, but whose quiet resourcefulness echoes forward through history all the way to this very moment, as you lie comfortably, listening to their story. As we gently close this long journey through history tonight, perhaps take a quiet moment to appreciate the simple comforts surrounding you right now. The soft blanket pulled up around you, the quiet warmth of your room, the modern conveniences so easily taken for granted, yet representing the accumulated result of thousands of years of human adaptation, innovation, and quiet resilience, carried forward by countless ordinary women across countless ordinary days, throughout the entire sweeping history of human civilization. There is something deeply peaceful in recognizing that history is not only made up of kings, wars, and famous historical figures, but also of countless quiet, ordinary moments. A woman washing linen by a river, a woman sipping warm tea beside a humble fire, a woman resting quietly within a moon lodge beneath a clear night sky. These ordinary moments, repeated endlessly across thousands of years, form the true, quiet foundation upon which all of human history actually rests. As you settle now into your own quiet evening, surrounded by modern comfort that countless generations of women before you could never have imagined, let this thought settle gently alongside you into sleep. Across every era, every culture, every corner of this vast and varied world, women have always found a way, quietly, resourcefully, generation after generation, carrying forward a thread of human resilience stretching back further than written history itself can fully record. Let your eyes close now, if they haven't already. Let your breathing slow, gentle, and steady. The Nile has gone quiet beneath the stars. The Acropolis sleeps beneath the same moon that watched over moon lodges across the ocean. The Viking hearth fires have burned down to soft embers. The medieval cottage candles have flickered out one by one. Every thread of this long, gentle history has settled now into peaceful rest, just as you are settling into your own peaceful rest tonight. Sleep well. You've traveled a long way through history this evening, and you've earned this quiet, comfortable rest. Good night.